check in. We are back. We are back.
We are back with another episode.
Yes. So how you doing?
I am pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. I had a day. Had a day today, but I'm glad that we're here. I'm glad that we're able to, have an extended conversation about mental health and what that might look like in relationships. Woo, that's a different story now. It's a different story.
Absolutely. And our conversation last week, I was thinking so much about it. When we left, I said, I am so excited for this topic that we're going to have tonight. So we are back with another episode to continue the conversation.
Yes, continuing the conversation. So as we are kind of jumping in, we're going to be talking about what it looks like to navigate different types of relationships during hard seasons. And jumping in right off the bat, family, because family is just different. When we think about family, we think about genetics. We think about maybe mama or our dad or our grandmother suffered from some things that are showing up now in our life. And so it's just being cognizant about what those kinds of things are. But as we kind of jump into what family support looks like, we have just a statistic here. We see that family support, when it's healthy, actually is one of the strongest predictors of recovery from mental illness. But on the other end, family dysfunction is also among the strongest triggers. So that relationship runs both ways. When we're thinking about mental health as it relates to our families, just a question, how do you think we should share that we might be going through a hard season or we might be struggling with our mental health with our families?
That's such a great question, and I feel like it depends on the relationship that you have with that family person. Let's say you're not too close with your mom, but you have an older sibling that you're very close to. You may lean on that older sibling and then share with them and then ask for their support, so that way you could bring it to your parents if you're not too close with your parents.
That's true. I think definitely rapport is something that we'll see across the line as it relates to all types of relationships. You just have to have a certain kind of connection to be able to disclose certain things to certain people, and that goes with family members too. I think the common thought is like, well, we're family, we just keep it in the family, and you could tell me anything that you're going through. And the reality is, it's like, wait, we haven't built a firm connection. We haven't, established that you're a safe space for me. So, it's not always that just because we're related by blood that they are going to be the safest space where we can disclose that we're going through some hard seasons or a mental illness.
And depending on what age you are, let's say that you're in high school, and oftentimes, the teenagers may have distance between their parents or guardian. So oftentimes they may go to the school counselor, school social worker to see if they can be that middle person also, because I think that's important. But because we're on the topic of family, and we're going to get to it when we talk about community also, it's really important to pool those resources or support to help us with those family dynamics,
Absolutely, because sometimes we do need somebody outside of the family to be able to speak to what's happening inside the family. Because, again, a lot of times families utilize the same resources that they've always used. So they'd be like, well, mama just, when she had a problem, she just went out and had a smoke and called it a day. And then grandmama did the same thing, and they both was out there smoking together. And and they might encourage you to do the same thing because that's the exposure that they've had to the resources or the coping mechanisms that they've used. But the reality is that sometimes we do need an external person, somebody that has been exposed to more positive ways to coping that can inform the entire family, because we take it back with us, right? But then we can go back to mom and be like, Mom, put that cigarette down now. You don't have to, you have to do this. Maybe we can do some breathing exercise. Maybe we can do something, something else. But we take some of those resources back with us when we have, when we gain access to an external person sometimes. So that's always really helpful.
Absolutely. And it's very helpful because Sometimes family dynamics, let's say your mom, your grandmother, they can say, oh, I've been doing this way before you were born, you don't know what you're talking about, so it's like they may minimize what their grandchild, what their son is talking about, but oftentimes, like, once they see that the younger, generation at home is starting to make positive changes, then they start to pay attention, okay, well, Johnny's making a positive change, let me really pay attention to see how I can support them, and make that change too, so I really like that.
I think this also brings up something, and I think there could also be a little pushback, because sometimes when we come with a positive change, it's like, oh, you think you're better than us, How do we navigate sometimes those feelings of, breaking like an unhealthy emotional coping mechanism without dishonoring the people that came before us, without dishonoring our parents or our grandparents? Like, what does that look like? I think that's a little difficult.
Yeah, that's tough. And that's a real question right there, I would say, honestly, like, last week we talked a lot about just holding on to, like, our faith and praying and having a prayer life. And depending on where you are in your prayer walk, I would say definitely, just talk to God on it. And oftentimes, if we have, like, a relative that's older than us or even the same age, like a sibling, oh, you think you're better than us because you're, making positive changes. But eventually they will start to see the change, even if you have to do it by yourself, because that, let's say it's a sibling set and one sibling's making better changes and the other sibling's not, but then they may say, okay, like negative comments and stuff like that. So it depends on that person or the relationship, because they may draw you closer or could draw you further apart. So.
And I definitely agree. The relationship will definitely be the telltale of how that person will respond to how you deal with the new strategies that you have, I think it's also like making sure we can't be brash as well. Like, I think sometimes we'll be like, Mama, just put that cigarette down, all these things that, like, once we have new information, right, once we're enlightened, sometimes we're not as kind as, we should be sometimes when we're telling people, hey, maybe that's not the most unhealthy, that's not the most healthy thing to do. Sometimes we have to, like, graciously add, like, I know that this is something that you've been exposed to, something that you have done for your whole life, but, there's another way, and it doesn't mean you gotta stop right now or stop, immediately, and just because I'm saying that, this is this new strategy that I've learned, it works for me, it might not work for you, but, it's something you can try, just being open and being gracious, and again, that relationship piece comes into it, because I think a part of that is, like, you can't hold on to the bitterness of what people did when they weren't exposed to positive coping mechanisms, right? Like, if we truly desire to see that person to change and to grow, we have to be willing to forgive, even in our hearts, even if they never apologize. Like, this is how I coped when, grandmama, mama, our father, this is how I coped when you were younger. And, you never get an apology for how that impacted you, but you can still show them the strategies that you use now. They might not be fully receptive, but they can't argue with results. And if you are seeing positive impact in your life based upon the positive strategies that you're using, you can't argue with that. So
absolutely. Yeah, and that kind of leads us into one of our questions. It's like, many people confuse boundaries with being unkind. So how can we explain to family members that setting boundaries is actually a form of stewardship over the life of God that gave them?
I think that is a really good, I think it's kind of in the question a little bit, because sometimes we don't know how to establish a boundary that, again, it has to do with rapport, right? Yeah, so how this person is going to interact with how you set the boundary, because you could say it in the sweetest like hi way. You might say, hey, you know, I really love you and I really appreciate you. I just need a little time to myself. And a person that is prone to being offended or living in a space of offense will always see that as rejection, or always see that as, if you don't want to spend time with me, you know. So you kind of have to meet that person where they are and speak to maybe one of the things that, you know, because when we set a boundary with a person, there's a reason why we set a boundary, right? And so whatever that reason is, we have to speak also to the spirit of that, you know, the spirit behind that, you know, because there might be a person that always wants to be around us, they want to cling to us, but we might just need a little bit of space. But a lot of that could be, you know, maybe their attachment style. They might have an anxious attachment. They got to feel like they got to be on you all the time, or they're not going to receive love from you, right? And so we kind of have to meet them where they are, and say, hey, I love you, girl. You know, hey, I love you. But I do need a little bit of time for myself here. Maybe we can hang out on this day and this time. And that's where they can feel reassured because, oh, I know the next time I'm going to spend time with this person. So it's just establishing, making sure the boundaries are clear. Sometimes we'd be like, I want to cut you off. And the boundary that is not clear.
Right.
You know, it's like, cut you off, but like, what does that look like communication-wise? Like, if I see you, am I not going to get a hi? Like, you know, so we just have to be clear, I think. But that's kind of like the strategies that I see when we think about boundaries.
And I really like those strategies that you gave off when it comes to setting boundaries. And my question is, like, can you set those same boundaries when it comes to like an older generation or a friend? Because I can think about, like, in my childhood, you know, they'll say, oh, you can't close the door or slam the door in here. You didn't pay no bills, so why are you closing and shutting the door? You better not slam my door, you know? So it's like, but that was my way of communicating, like, I needed time to myself, whatever that situation may have been when I was younger, you know, or even, like, say, like, in childhood, adolescence, you say, I'm feeling, like, if you're by yourself, don't really want to eat dinner with everyone, nothing may not necessarily be wrong, per se, but you may not want to eat dinner, so how do you communicate that, like, I don't want to eat dinner right now, and the older generation's like, well, I just made this dinner tonight, you gotta eat this food that I just made, you know, but how do we create that space of boundaries with older, you know, generation?
I think that's a really great question because it's hard setting boundaries with like an older generation because I also feel like while there's a lot that we owe older generations because they set the pace, they set the tone for us, and they have done so much sacrificing just so that we can have in our life. I think setting boundaries, again, it has to fall under a space of respect. There still has to be a level of respect there. And then trying to meet them where they are, right? You know, I think as a child it's hard. You know, as a child it's like, you ain't been, you know, you had those struggles yet. But like, I think sometimes we have to allow them to see us as not a child, but as a person with real issues and real concerns and real life that be life in, because sometimes older generations will be like, oh, you ain't even experienced life yet. They'll be like, well, if I ain't experienced life yet, I don't know what life is. Right. I've done experienced some things now. So, you know, sometimes it's about getting into the nitty gritty and just being transparent. I think sometimes it's like, you know, we fall into a space of, you know, I don't want to disclose too much, but sometimes that's what maybe an older generation person needs to be able to identify with, oh wow, she's been through a lot today. I can remember being that age and feeling like this heaviness. Maybe that's why she needs this boundary. And I think it's about, you know, maybe just being transparent in that moment. You know, maybe not disclosing all of your feelings and emotions if you feel like it's not the safest space, but just being honest and real so that you can bring them where you are.
And then also I think it goes down to, like you mentioned, the respect and the communication style, because you can still communicate your feelings, but like last week we talked about like those positive ways of coping, you know. The example I use, I'm communicating, I'm slamming my door. You know, like, that's a communication, you know, it's not the one that slide well in the household at that time, so I make sure not to do that again, so, I think it goes both ways, with the parenting and with the child, and even when we're young adults, like, having that, still having that respect, but then still being able to be transparent and communicating that.
Yeah, I think, it's definitely them becoming more familiar with, how we choose to communicate those different types of boundaries. And perhaps if we if we don't communicate them in the most gracious or the cleanest way, that we're humble enough to say, hey, I needed this time. I didn't have the capacity at this point to be the most respectful, but I do, apologize, or I do, want to communicate this in a clear way so that, there's nothing, nothing that can be misconstrued about what I communicated.
Absolutely.
But I think, that kind of takes us into a thought and idea of how do we have some of these, setting some of these boundaries and how they balance with our family. I do think we do have a question. How do you have those conversations with the older generation who flips the script and makes it about them? Then you find yourself walking away feeling unheard and in the same space.
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah. Honestly, I definitely feel like one thing that you and I talked about, even just separately from the podcast, is like one thing that's going to come up throughout all of this is pride. Pride is the thing that keeps us from support, keeps us from receiving support, keeps us from giving support. But I think when we have some of these conversations, right, pride is in the room. Pride is lingering in the corner, right? Pride is like, let me see how she's going to respond. Let me see how, because when it comes down to some of the conversations about hard seasons or mental health, especially with older generations, they may internalize like, I ain't do nothing to you. They might say, oh, you had a great childhood, and
you turned out fine.
you turned out fine, right? Like you fine. And that's literally, that's a big thing in families, especially when it comes down to Black families. Black families, I think sometimes instead of addressing the issues that come up in our family, we just cover it with a Band-Aid and say, well, I'm fine. And a lot of that has to do with the pride, right? But when we talk about having some of these conversations and pride is in the room, and an older generation or just somebody else, it could be a cousin, it could be a brother or a sister, right, that begins to make it about themselves. I think it's important to, again, I'm going to say, speak to the spirit behind it. What is it that what do you hear when they make it about themselves, right? Like, do you feel like they're making it about themselves because they actually feel guilty or feel bad about what you might be experiencing, or they don't know how to help you, and now they are trying to pivot and direct it towards themselves, right? Or, they're like, you're going through something, well, I've been going through something for 20 years, and so this is the time for, to let it all loose. Because I think that sometimes that people don't utilize a safe space, and then once they find a space where people are sharing their feelings, they want to use that space, and now they want to take that space, right? And so I think even though we don't want to hear it, right, it's important to, even in that moment, validate their feelings and then try to pivot back to what you were talking about, and to what you are disclosing about what the boundaries that you want to set, right? Because the people that we set boundaries with oftentimes don't have the tools. There's probably boundaries they should have been set, but they haven't set them. And so now that you're establishing a boundary with them, it feels like abrasive. It feels aggressive. It feels because they don't set proper boundaries, they now feel offended because the presence of a boundary feels aggressive.
Right.
When in fact it's just assertive, it's just establishing, hey, I need this space, I need this time, I need this connection to look like this. But if you've never had the tools or the coping mechanisms to be able to set those boundaries in place, you're in a space where you're constantly pouring out or giving out, or you're constantly pushing your feelings back or neglecting your own stuff, or even prioritizing yourself but still not addressing the things in the room that need to be addressed. So I think that we have to remember when we're setting boundaries with people, that the people that we're setting boundaries with likely do not have the tools to receive the boundaries that we're putting in place. So we have to try to speak to, I know it's hard to say take the high road, but validate that person and how they're feeling, because that's something that you would have wanted. But also be able to pivot back to how to say, hey, listen, I understand how you feel about this, concerning this. If you feel like they are feeling guilty, like maybe take it off of them. Say, hey, this has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
This has everything to do with my quality of life and how I want to live, right? It has nothing to do with you. And so I think sometimes that can help as well. But.
Right. And then also what you were saying, as far as like when it comes to setting those boundaries, it can be really difficult on both ends, because maybe the other person, you're used to saying yes all the time and doing everything that they say, or merely answering their call. So when you start to set those boundaries, it's like, wow, they may say that you're, acting quote unquote funny, acting brand new. But I think it's really important to, like you had mentioned, validate their feelings. And it doesn't mean that you're cutting them off, but then again, like you mentioned, pray about it, see what the Spirit says, because sometimes you may need to love them from a distance if you're not respecting that boundary, because it becomes more of a conflict when you try to put those boundaries in place and they're still like, okay, I'm not going to listen to what you said, I'm still going to answer because you're my little sister. You know what I mean? So it's like, who cares? But it matters,
And at that point, you just kind of have to be like, listen, if that's your response, then I'm just going to have to move how I'm going. That's just how it's going to have to be.
Yeah.
But I think that's a great question, because sometimes that's exactly what we experience in family, where we're trying to establish a boundary and don't necessarily, it's not received well. And so in those spaces, like how do we balance setting that boundary, right? But then also like this biblical push to like, oh, forgive them, forgive them because, God forgave you. How do we set that balance between setting a boundary and forgiving? Is it two different things? Is it the same thing?
That's a really good question. And I think, and like this is just my opinion, I do believe that it's two different things, because you can set a boundary and still be very upset with them, like we talked about, but we didn't go into details, like, and I would see it all over social media, like, I'm protecting my peace, protecting your peace, but you're not protecting your peace if you're ignoring that person, so, or if you're, just not really sharing how you truly feel. So that's not protecting your peace. But for me, I had to learn protecting your peace means having those uncomfortable conversations, but, praying about it and saying, you know what, I still love you, I'm still here for you, but we can't always, continue our friendship, our family relationship the same way. But it had to take me years to do that, so for me, I would say it's not a one-time thing, especially when you're new at it, so it's not like, oh, I'm just going to say it one time, but like just being like repetitive, and then also going to them and say, hey, I still love you, I'm still your sister, I'm still here, so that way they know that you still have that relationship, you're still thinking of them, because you don't want to lose that relationship altogether, so, but as far as when it comes to forgiveness, depending on that relationship we talked about again, if you already have that close relationship with that person, we can say, you know what, I forgive you, and I still want us to continue being friends. I still want you to have a relationship with my kids and so forth. So, like, you can be honest and say, I miss you, so I forgive you, as long as you don't do that again or cross that boundary, you know, you're more than welcome to still come over to my house. So I think that forgiveness and setting those boundaries do play a role, but in my opinion, I think it's two different.
Absolutely, I definitely agree. I think that, I love the fact that you talk about having those hard conversations, because a lot of times when people set boundaries, they want to skip that part. They want to skip the part, they're like, again, like, I just want to cut this person off, I'll never talk to this person, let me block you on all social media, and, you know, and really what you've done is now you're kind of placing yourself in a prison of feelings that you're not able to communicate, right? You just kind of have those ruminating. Now, there's some times where we do have to go no contact, right? For our safety, for our well-being, but when it comes down to it, you know, if you feel like you don't have the wherewithal or it's unsafe for you to have those conversations, sometimes forgiveness is happening in your heart, and maybe you can't go and have the conversation, or with somebody who is maybe passed away, right? You know, that boundary, of course, is not, you know, you don't have to worry about a boundary, but the forgiveness happens internally, right? And so for people who are still living, you know, and you know that they might reach out and things like that, but you just really don't believe that it's the right time, or you really do need to go no contact, I definitely feel like it's two separate things. You can still accept in your heart and forgive them so that you can move forward. And then should the opportunity arise for you to have the conversation where you feel like maybe you're at peace with what happened, or you feel that you are in a safer space where you can have that conversation, and then establish an additional boundary. But I definitely think it's two separate things. I think you can forgive somebody separately and then set a boundary, or set a boundary and then, you know, slowly begin to forgive, you know, and start that process and that journey.
Absolutely, very true.
So we can actually take a little pivot to our friends' perspective, or our friends section. So as we just kind of dive into friends, one of the things that came up for me when I was thinking about friendships, right? I thought about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? I thought about how Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane getting ready to be arrested. He was getting ready to go up to Calvary, but he asked his three closest friends to come up to the garden with him and stay and watch and pray, right? And so when he kept going back down, they were asleep. They were asleep. And, you know, I think, you know, when we think about friendships, right? Sometimes we have friendships that we love them, but maybe they can't show up for us in a really difficult season. Now, Jesus, he was really, you know, he was crying out to the Father. He was also sweating, you know, literally sweating blood. He was in extreme distress, and he asked for these three of his disciples, his closest disciples, to come up with him and pray and watch and pray with him. And so it just reminds me of, sometimes we have friendships, right? When we're going through some really difficult seasons, that they might not be the best to be asked to, you know, watch and pray with us. But how do we deal and how do we manage those types of friendships where, you know, we're in a difficult season and they can't really show up for us?
I just want to start off and say I just love how you just shared that biblical story and then apply it to real life, you know, because oftentimes, especially as young adults, it's like you may hear like a scripture, but you're like, okay, what does this relate to me? Like, how does this relate to me? So, like, as far as like when we're in like a difficult season and we have a friend that's not really there for us, like, how can we be there? Or what was the question?
How can we? Have you ever asked for your friends to be there actually during a difficult season and they weren't able to show up for you?
Okay.
And how did you manage that? So that was really
Okay.
how do you manage like friends that maybe can't show up for you in a difficult season?
It's hurtful. So I'll just say that it's very hurtful, especially when they're going through something and you're there for them. You know. So when it's like you're now in a difficult season, it's like, okay, well, where were you when I needed you, so it's really difficult, and how did I manage it? It let me know where we stand as friends, as close friends, close friends, and I learned that, like I said, like I'll still love them, but we're not as close anymore, so unfortunately it's like, we're not as close, but I just know that like, you're not an emotional safe place for me to go to, so, because a lot of times like we do want our friends to be there and talk to us, and I remember, I don't know when it was, but Pastor had even talked about it, like we go to our friends when we're immediately going through something. We go to our significant other when we're immediately going through something, instead of going to God first, So it was a blessing in disguise because it allowed me to like, okay, God, what should I do? What do you think I should do in this situation? Because my friend's not answering her phone, so I need to talk to somebody, so God's like, I'm here, just talk to me, so that kind of helped in a way.
I love that. I love that you spoke to the fact that God can be that place, right? God can be that refuge. And I think that one thing we can be certain and sure about is that God is always equipped to handle the heaviness on our heart. I think that when it comes down to friends, sometimes you gotta know which friends to go to with certain things now, because not everybody is equipped to handle some of the things that you're going through, right? And so the same way that we know, we can go to God for anything, but when it comes down to people, when it comes down to friends, when it comes down to family, not everybody is equipped to deal with your heaviness, and we have to be discerning about the people that we are, surrounding ourselves with, just in general. But not to say that every friend is a bad friend because they can't show up for you in a season, because even Jesus, even though Peter was down there sleeping, he still was saying, he's going to be the rock of the church. He still had faith that there was still good in Peter, right? And so I think that we have to be honest about, be realistic with ourselves, the expectations that we set for other people and our friends, because sometimes we want our friend to be everything, and we ain't even go to God. We ain't even go to somebody who is equipped to deal with our heaviness, right? And I think that is that's something that I feel is very important to spotlight, because a lot of different friends, depending on whatever season they're in, we might not even want to dump to our friends, and our friend is going through a hard season. Right? And the hurt that we might experience because they can't show up for us might be a little bit selfish, because maybe we didn't consider whether or not they were actually equipped or prepared to handle our heaviness at the time, right? And so one thing that I like to do sometimes is, like, with my friends, like, especially if I know if they're going through something, I'll be like, girl, are you okay for me to talk about this? Like, is this okay for us to talk about this? Or like, I'll just discern the moment, there's nothing wrong with reading the room, just be like, hey, listen, maybe this is not the time to bring up, the craziness that happened for the day, when I know my friend is experiencing something heavy, and then vice versa, having a friend that acknowledges, maybe this isn't the right time for me to share this while my friend is going through something deep and heavy. So I think it can happen on both ends.
Yes. And just like you mentioned, like, being able to be discerning, I think that's really important, because oftentimes, like, we just jump in to share, like, our heaviness, and sometimes our friends are like, okay, like, let's pause, and, if you're just going on and on and on, it's like, okay, I can't even get a word in because you just keep talking, so I think it's really important to, like you mentioned, discern and share, like, okay, how am I feeling, and how is the other person feeling to receive that? Because oftentimes, like, when you, in my opinion, it's like when you're sharing the heaviness, they may check out, oh, I'm cooking something, even if they're making it up, oh, I got something on the stove, I gotta go, oh, I hear my daughter in the other room crying, so I gotta go. So it's like, they're not available, so then you have to have the discernment, like, okay, how much should I share, or is this the appropriate person for me to talk to?
Absolutely. I think that definitely, that discernment is real. And we have to do that before we get into our hard season.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes the hard season will reveal it, but sometimes based on the types of friendships that you have and how you're able to communicate with one friend versus another friend can tell you exactly like, oh, I can trust them with certain things, or that this type of thing. Or I think it's hard because we find ourselves in disappointment when we try to entrust a certain friend to some information that we have, but we have not thought about the extent in which it looks like. Yes. Looking at the comments, I see that Minister Kim, she said, setting boundaries is hard on both sides, but it's necessary. And I see that Pastor Mo said, yeah, it's a tough reality, and it makes you question friendship. Kind of what you were saying when we think about the friends that we have, and if we're not able to trust them in hard seasons, like it's like I don't know, like should you really be my friend, right? And so it's especially when it's time after time again. Time after time again, I try to entrust you with something and you can't show it for me. Now we gotta have a conversation, you know? And maybe sometimes you gotta take them down. We're friends that maybe, you know, every now and then we check in with each other, make sure we're okay because there's still love there. But I know that the deep things, the hard things, especially when we think about the people and what they show up with when it's our hard season, right? Do they ask, hey, can I pray with you? Hey, did they encourage you? Like, did they speak to what you're going through? How did they navigate that? Did they ask you questions? Sometimes my biggest thing is when my friends are going through certain things, like I like to ask questions because sometimes, you know, it's a blanket statement of like, I'm not feeling it. And it's like, well, what do you mean you're not feeling it? You know? And sometimes it helps to dig a little bit deeper in how they're feeling so that I can speak to the very thing that they're experiencing. Because when you're going through a season, or you're going through something hard, sometimes the last thing you want to do is feel like you need to over communicate. But as a friend, I try to make it easy to kind of gain that information without it feeling like I'm telling you my whole life story, right? Like, it's like, oh, okay, you're speaking to this particular thing, so let me encourage you in this area.
And I really like how you mentioned that you ask questions because you're helping that friend process how they're feeling. And that kind of leads us into one of our questions. It's like, what is the difference between being a supportive friend and taking on the role of a savior or therapist? You know, because one of my friends, former friends now, but like when I was talking to him, he was like, oh, I'm not trying to be one of your therapists. Like, he mentioned something like, don't therapy me today, meaning that like, and I'm just asking honest questions, you know what I mean? But he felt like I was asking too many deep questions, and oftentimes like they're not in the space to respond to those questions, and I really like that. Sometimes, you know, our friends can see that strength in us. Oh, she gives great advice, she's a great listener, I could be on the phone with her for 3 hours, you know, and sometimes we can give our friends that space, those 3 hours, but like realistically, it's like, can we really do that every week, you know? So it's like, how does it look like being a supportive friend versus like being a savior?
And I definitely, I think it's a fine line. I think it's a fine line. I think you can support really well without feeling the need like you're this person's therapist or savior. And I think a lot of it has to do with discerning the moment, because sometimes what that person needs is that you just sit there with them and allow them to speak. Sometimes what that person needs is maybe they just need to get out the house. Hey girl, let's go. Let's go to the mall or something, right? Maybe they don't need a lecture every time. And I gotta tell myself that, because one thing about me, my friends know I'm gonna give a lecture every time. But I'm trying to do better with trying to find other ways in which I can show up for my friends. because I'm also the type of person that's like, I wanna fix it, I wanna fix all of it, you know? I wanna make sure you don't feel this way anymore. But I think that has a lot to do with my own personal challenges with, you know, making sure that I can give them to God, allow whatever they're going through and the burdens that they're experiencing and the heaviness that they're experiencing, I don't internalize it, but I give it to God. And so I have an assurance that God will see them through their hard season. And I think that's how you separate yourself from being their savior and being, just a good friend. I think, when you allow God to have them and let God be their savior, and pray for them, fervently, but also show up in ways that are human ways, show up in ways that just allow them to feel like a person, and allow you to feel like a person and not feel the weight of whatever they're going through. So I think it happens on both ends, and so it could, on the end of a person who is seeking for you to be a therapist, recommend a therapist to them, okay? Recommend a therapist. Recommend a therapist, but also try to find other ways that you can show up for them, so that it doesn't always feel like you are the person that they're leaning on, especially when you know that you're not fully equipped to be their all in all, right? And maybe it might be setting that boundary, and I know for me, I personally love, again, I'm gonna shout her out, my therapist. I love my therapist, and I think that it's so helpful to know the difference, because sometimes when it's just two sister girls talking to each other, it's like, oh, well, you're my therapist and I'm your therapist, but when you actually get in therapy with a person that's actually doing therapy, it's like, oh no, what we was doing was probably not therapy. Yeah. We were not therapizing, okay? We were probably to some degree enabling, and then, giving a little razzle dazzle of encouragement here and there. But when you're able to know the difference, when you put your friends in the hands of a real savior, when you put your friends in the hands of a real therapist, you can just show up and just be a friend,
Absolutely, and I just love those examples that you share, because oftentimes, especially if we have a friend, because I'm like that, if I have a close friend and they're going through it, I'm like, God, how can I be there for them? How can I show up for them? And I start taking on their burdens. I'm immediately thinking about, how can I fix it, So being able to show up in other ways, that way you're not enabling them. So let's say they ask you, they're showing a bill, and you give them $100 this week. Next month, you still giving them $100. The following month, you still giving them $100. Okay, what's going on? Because they're so used to you fixing it, So definitely it's important to still be there for them, but then knowing how to have that boundary with them too.
Yeah, setting that boundary again is going to be important, because especially when people are leaning on you to be a certain type of way, and we have shown up a certain type of way time after time again, it's hard to say, hey, I can't be your crutch anymore.
Yeah.
I have to let you go. I have to let you go into the hands of somebody that is more equipped. And that might be a hard conversation, but somebody who cares about you and loves you, also will understand, hey, maybe I've been leaning on this person, and they're human too. They go through life too. They, they have needs as well. So, I think also being able to have a real conversation, and sometimes it comes from a lack of our transparency, because we haven't disclosed, hey, I'm going through a hard season, girl, I can't be here in this way for you, or I can show up like this, but I can't show up like the way I've been showing up, because I'm going through something, or because I've realized that it's not taking me in the way that I need to, in the direction I need to go. So it's that conversation about boundaries, but it's also, being transparent. Sometimes our transparency, because we want to seem like we got it all together, we want to make it seem like, oh yeah, I can be there for you, I can be Superwoman. We're missing out on an opportunity for somebody to see us as a human being, and not a machine, or not, somebody that goes through the same way that they're going through.
That's very true, very true.
And Reverend Mo said, not enabling family and friends is something we know we should stop, but it's often a challenge when we just want them to be happy, which is very, very true.
Yeah.
Like, we just want to fix it for them. We want them to be happy. We want them to live their best life. But at the same time, we don't want it to obstruct us living our best life. Like, there has to be a balance, and we have to know that enabling family and friends is not really, it's temporary. It's temporary happiness. It's not allowing them to experience joy, because in order for them to have joy, they would be dependent on the Lord and not you, you know? We are, we're here to, help them in whatever capacity. And sometimes it's tough love. Sometimes it's saying, hey, I got some tough love. And that's kind of leading us into a question. What is the difference between speaking the truth in love and telling it how it is, or being brutally honest?
Ooh, that's a good question.
You can't say amen, say ouch, okay?
I actually had a situation where I had to be brutally honest. This was when I was in college, because we had a friend who she was trying to finish school on time, and she got pregnant, and we was like, we don't want you to drop out of school. So my roommate and I said, you know what, you can you can stay with us for like a month. We don't have a lot of friends that come over, this is your space, But then she started inviting her friends over to our apartment and, not clean up after herself. It was like, okay, a month turned into 3 months now. Like, wait a minute. She said she was going to do all this stuff to help us out and pitch in. And she did it. So with me, like you had mentioned earlier, like that was how I was before. It's like, okay, I just want them to be happy. I want to make sure that they're good. I want to fix the situation, because at the end of the day, we do want her to graduate on time, especially if she didn't have that support from family, because oftentimes your friends can turn into that community and family-like relationship. So, but then we had to be brutally honest. We said, listen, you have until the end of that month to clean up this place, and give us some money that you said you're going to help us with, or you're going to have to move out. First of all, you have to move out, because we were sharing her like apartments to look at and everything. She was like, oh, I'll get to it. But once we put our foot down, she listened, And I think what it was is like, she took advantage because we were so nice to her, and she thought like, oh, they're my friends. They know my situation. They'll be okay with it. But this was temporary, like you had mentioned earlier. This is a temporary thing. We're here to help you in the temporary, but this is not like long term. Your name's not on this list, So we don't need an extra roommate. Thank you. So, but she definitely understood, and we remained friends, because oftentimes like, you're like, oh, you gonna talk to me like that? But sometimes you have to talk to people like that. It's not really how you say it, but you have to be firm, not necessarily like being rude, but it's all about like, even like growing up, my grandmother would say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it, so being firm and assertive to not aggressive.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, and I like that you kind of said, like, you named it brutally honest, but I don't think that was brutally honest. I think it was still firm, and I think that's still speaking the truth in love, because you still care for her, because you wanted the best for her, and it wasn't disrespectful, but it was a matter of, hey, girl, you got to get your stuff together now. You got to get all moving, okay? And I think sometimes we do need to address how we, set those boundaries or speak the truth, because sometimes it can come off disrespectful. Sometimes it's like you are operating from a place of offense, and so it's easy for it to come off very aggressive, if we're not mindful of what we're saying. And so I definitely would say that I'm along those same lines. Like, I'm learning still the art of speaking the truth in love. Sometimes I'm very tell it how it is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I've ever been brutally honest, but I'm very tell it how it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be like, let's just be frank. That's my
Yeah.
that's my favorite. That's my favorite term, because I'm not about to go around in circles with you, okay? But let's just be frank. But sometimes the telling it how it is not always very sensitive to how that person is feeling. And, we have to, again, be able to read the room and be able to discern how we should have these conversations, because they're hard conversations. They're always going to be hard, right? And we have to be mindful of how, because these are the things, these hard seasons are the way that character is shown as well. And so what you've been working on, all year long on your character, when you have a hard season, it's gonna show.
It's gonna show.
It's gonna show, okay? And so if you ain't had patience all year long and you've been like, God, give me some patience, He's gonna give you a situation where you gotta be patient. And how you deal with that is how, it will be evidence of character development. But I think a lot of times what we see with speaking in love, when we're under that pressure, how do we address people? How do we navigate those tough situations, those tough conversations with love, with desiring the best for that person, even after they've offended us? And that's a whole, offense is a whole other space that, we probably can't get into, but it's definitely important when we think about our mental health. Being able to communicate clearly how, a certain season is impacting our mental health, but also being honest when maybe somebody is triggering to that, or maybe when we do need to establish boundaries, how do we do it in a gracious and loving way, where it's also firm, like you said, it's firm and assertive to me, like, hey, I love you, but this ain't gonna fly right now, this ain't gonna fly ever, so that's definitely super important.
Very true, and you pretty much answered one of our questions as far as like how can we be there when somebody's having a mental health concern, and be supportive for them. And you pretty much answered that too. And I love how you mentioned as far as like it can help us with developing our character, because the last thing we want to do is, confuse enabling to fixing it. Like we're not here to fix your problems, but we're here to support you, to help you get through them. Whether that's resources like a therapist or just being there in other ways, so that way they can know that you're there for them. Because oftentimes, like, you feel like you're by yourself, but then when you find somebody that, ooh, she listens, I'm just gonna talk to her all day. She listens. Yeah, let me get real comfortable. Let me make some popcorn because I know she's about to listen to everything I've just been through all day.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, I got other things to do.
Right.
Yeah. So that's really important.
Absolutely. I know we're running low on time, but we did want to touch a little bit into community. When we think about 1 Corinthians 12:24 through 27, it says, so God has put the body together such that extra honor and care are given to those that have less dignity. This makes for harmony among the members so that all the members care for each other. If one part suffers, all the parts suffer with it. And if one part is honored, all the parts are glad. All of you together are Christ's body, and each of you is a part of it. And so it just kind of brings me to an idea about the broader community, right? We talk about friends, we talk about family, but how do we lean into one another's suffering when it's just another member of the body of Christ, or just a community member, somebody in our church that we might not be, super close with, but we know that they're going through something. How do we lean into that suffering?
So when we're leaning into that suffering, I would say, even if we can't, if we don't necessarily understand what they're going through, I would say leaning into it will be more empathetic and showing that compassion for them, and just like you had mentioned earlier, it's like being able to validate how they feel. Because depending on their family dynamic, maybe their family dynamic, their feelings are not validated, or, they come from a household, a generation where it's like, they never talk about their feelings. So when you do have a community where you're able to, you know, talk with no judgment, it's like, okay, I can be there for you and empathize and show my compassion and love for you.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, even over time, like, you can gain rapport with somebody, but, you know, just like we're doing right now, doing a check-in, you know, checking in with a person that we might not be super close with. You know, of course, we are close with friends, we're close with family, but sometimes it's just important for us to check in with the people around us that, you know, we see might pass us every day. You know, with a coworker that we might not talk to every day. You know, just asking them, hey, how are you? And then allowing, you know, studies say that if you say, hey, how are you doing? At least make sure when you say, how are you doing, make sure you have 15 minutes to listen. Because just in case, what if they're not doing well? And you need to take some time. You don't want to just, you know, haphazardly say, how are you doing, and don't have the capacity to really listen and take the time to spend with them after you're checking in with them. So, you know, just checking in with the people around you. You might not have a close relationship with them, but, you know, God made us all, you know, we are all children of God, and we all deserve just a person that can say, hey, how are you doing? You know, hey, I'm thinking about you. Hey, God loves you. You know, things like that can change and alter that person's day, can alter that person's week. Sometimes people just need to be seen. And when we acknowledge that we see that person, you know, I think we were going to talk about this also, like, you know, sometimes the close friend or that family member, we know you care about us, right? But it's the person that sits across the classroom and it says, hey, are you okay? You know, because we feel seen in a space where we generally don't feel seen. And so being that person to see people in spaces where they might not always feel seen can definitely transform that person's day or transform that person's life. You just never know.
You never know. And just, you know, just smiling at somebody, you know, and to make a long story short, my job this month, we had an staff appreciation lunch, and they gave me a card, and like, these are like managers, the leadership, and I barely talk to you other than, hi, how are you doing? And they mentioned, I love how you just say, you smile all the time, it brightens up my day. And I'm like, really? Because I've never talked to you. So you just never know what kind of impact you're having, even if it's a small impact. So yeah.
Absolutely, that body language, having like open body language, having positive body language, showing up with good energy, showing up, you know, good morning, you know, you really never know how that can shift, you know, like we talked about last week, shift the culture, shift the space that you're working in, shift wherever you're, you know, operating or interacting in. So that is something that I think how we can help our community, how we can assist.
And then also before we move on, like another example, we had talked offline about it, but like sometimes at work, you may have a work bestie and you have lunch with this person all the time, you know, and you're able to talk about work-related things, and then they transfer into friendships because now you're talking about personal things with this person, your coworker, but then sometimes you may pick up as a friend, you know, hey, are you okay? You seem a little off today. You know what, I'm glad you stopped me. I do need, you know, 5-10 minutes of a break. I'll cover your shift for the first 10-15 minutes. You go to the back and do what you need to do and come back, you know? So just being able to be seen and heard, and just our body language, you know, they were able to pick that up. So our friendships within our community is important too.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know we are wrapping up for the night. I know we have a couple of resources you want to share. Our resources?
Yes, and we definitely want to continue, you know, so please feel free to like email the church email if you have any questions. We're going to share this in the chat and with the resources that we have. Because we are in Baltimore City and in the Park Heights community, there is an organization, a nonprofit organization called Park Heights Community Health Alliance. They offer mindfulness classes, yoga, and it is Black-owned. So if you're ever interested in some meditation just to help you with slowing down and unwinding from your week, they have great resources. I actually have never been there, but I do plan to check it out, especially since it's walking distance from our church.
Absolutely.
And another resource we have is baltimorecity.gov, is a health, is a link that you can go to where you can get like a lot of different resources there, and also 24/7 mental health and substance use help. You can call a 988, so it's a crisis line. So let's say your sister, your brother, your friend is not available. This line is available 24/7, so please reach out to them if you don't have anybody available to talk to.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we're just so excited because as we're wrapping up Mental Health Awareness Month, you know, these are resources that you can use, you know, whenever. But there's so much out there, so keep continuing to dig, keep continuing to look into what works for you. Keep looking into different types of coping mechanisms, positive coping mechanisms that work for you and your lifestyle and how you go about your schedule. And I think that's one of the most amazing things about mental health awareness is that sometimes, you know, we're not aware. And we just need to be exposed to the right information. And so I'm glad that this can be a space where we can share that information, and feel welcome to share this information with other people as well. So we just thank you for showing up for our check-in podcast. It's been phenomenal, great conversation. And we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.